Today we celebrate Veterans Day, that day when in this country we rightfully honor all those who have given up a portion of their life to serve. But Veterans Day was not originally that at all. Veterans Day was originally a celebration of peace. It was called Armistice Day, and it commemorated that moment exactly 100 years ago today, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, when World War I, one of the most pointless wars in history, finally came to an end, or as the American writer Kurt Vonnegut put it, that moment when millions upon millions of human beings decided to stop butchering one another. World War I was, up until that time, the most terrible act of destruction in the history of humanity. We have since perfected the art of butchering one another, but up until that time, during the 5 long, senseless years of that war, 20 million human beings were slaughtered. And the influenza epidemic that was spread as a direct result of the war resulted in the deaths of a further 100 million in the most devastating plague known to human history. So many lives buried, so many gifts of God buried, so much future buried, an entire generation wiped out. The Pope in Rome, a wonderful man by the name of Benedict XV, was known as the Pope of Peace. With the voice of God, he pleaded and pleaded with the leaders of the world to stop the senseless slaughter of the young men of the world being used as cannon fodder for no other purpose than to satisfy the pride of the ruling elite. In 1917, the Pope, after pleading time and time again, came up with a brilliant plan for peace to save the world, and placed that plan on the consciences of those who were running the world and slaughtering the youth. The plan was rejected by the leaders, except for the saintly Emperor of Austria-Hungary, Kaiser Karl. It was rejected because the leaders were so intent on total victory, so intent on total destruction of the other side, so intent on their pride. The voice of God fell on deaf ears. A brilliant poet came out of the trenches of World War I, my favorite English poet from that generation, by the name of Wilfred Owen, a 25-year-old young man who, in the trenches, wrote some of the most powerful poetry ever presented in the English language. In one of his most poignant poems, Wilfred Owen retells the familiar story of Abraham's attempted sacrifice of his son Isaac, but he tells it in the trenches of war. So Abram rose and clave the wood and went, and took the fire with him and a knife. And as they sojourned both of them together, Isaac the firstborn spake and said, My father, behold the preparations, fire and iron, but where the lamb for this burnt offering? Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth the knife to slay his son, when lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. That generation was wiped out, for no other reason but the pride and greed of a few. The voice of God arose in the poet no less than in the Pope. But the voice fell again on deaf ears. The war continued. The slaughter continued. Mothers wept. The Pope wept. God wept. And so we can imagine the jubilation at that 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, when this senseless butchery conducted by the human species upon itself for a few inches of land finally came to an end. We can imagine the relief and jubilation of the peoples of the world, most especially in Europe, where their entire younger generation had been senselessly obliterated. This Armistice Day was set up as a time to celebrate peace in the world, with prayer and the ringing of church bells and the remembrance of the dead. But the Pope in Rome, whose calls for peace had gone unheeded because of pride and greed, was not even allowed to come to the peace conference, because the victorious leaders did not wish to hear the voice of God, but wanted instead totally to crush their vanquished enemies, and in so doing set the stage for the next World War. What happened to the young poet, 25-year-old Wilfred Owen, who wrote some of the most powerful poetry yet produced? Just as the bells of peace were being rung in his hometown at that 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, news was brought to his parents that in the very last days of the war he had been shot and killed. Such gifts buried, such lives, such loves, such futures all snuffed out. Kurt Vonnegut tells us in his book Breakfast of Champions that he has spoken to old men who were on the battlefields at that 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, and that sudden silence was for them the voice of God. There are still people on this earth who remember that moment when God spoke directly and powerfully to a humanity engaged in destroying itself. That voice can still be heard. Let us open our ears and listen before it is too late. Before it is too late to hear any voice at all.